I don't think it's unfair to say that movie adaptations of musicals can be hit or miss. Most musical theater fans would agree that Wicked Part 1 was nothing short of magical. And the general public agrees that Cats 2019 is, well, it's Cats 2019. But for every movie where the consensus is fairly consistent, there's one that draws much more mixed reactions. Sometimes the polarizing reception makes sense. For every person who loves Tim Burton's take on Sweeney Todd, there's going to be another who wishes he hadn't cut Kiss Me, or The Ballad of Sweeney Todd, or Mea Culpa. There's one movie musical, however, where this discrepancy honestly comes as a shock to me. Now, don't get me wrong, people are absolutely entitled to dislike this movie. But whenever I see people act as if it's on the same level as Cats 2019, and act as if that's an accepted consensus, I can't help but wonder how they came to that conclusion. After all, this was, for a time, the highest grossing film adaptation of a musical ever. It was nominated for many awards and won quite a few of them. It was listed in a book of 1,000 movies you have to see before you die. It took YouTube by storm. Most importantly, it changed my life. But more on that later. So let's take a look at the 2012 film adaptation of Les Miserables, and why, in my opinion at least, it's actually awesome. Chapter 1. The Beginning. Long before he unleashed Cats 2019 upon the world, Tom Hooper was actually a respected director. Fresh off the success of Best Picture winning The King's Speech, he began negotiations to direct the film adaptation of Les Mis in 2011, with production starting later that year. The cast slowly came together, with the film eventually releasing on Christmas Day in 2012. It wasn't perfect, I'll go over some of that later, but it was a massive success, and for the most part it was widely praised at the time. And it was everywhere! Song parodies based on Les Mis received millions more views than they would have without the movie's influence. Fan art flooded Tumblr to the point that Les Mis was seen as a mainstream fandom the way Doctor Who or Star Wars was. And this praise and admiration didn't just happen for no reason. There was a lot of thought, love, and effort that went into this movie, both from the cast and from the people behind the scenes. Anne Hathaway's dedication to her role as Fantine was so incredible that I'll have to go into more detail on it later. And Hugh Jackman has said that playing Jean Valjean was actually harder than playing Wolverine. This film wasn't afraid to take risks, and many of these risks paid off. Until the recent release of the Wicked film, it was, again, the highest-grossing movie adaptation of a stage musical in box office history. It was made on a budget of $61 million and brought in over $400 million. Something about this movie must have made it the success it was. So, I'm going to try to go song by song, scene by scene, more or less, and figure out why. Don't worry, it won't take me 3 hours. Probably. Chapter 3. The Play-by-Play. The film begins with a text card that should hopefully educate any of the misguided people who think Les Mis is about the French Revolution. Right away, we hear the beating of the drums. Waves crash against the shipyard as the orchestra starts to kick in while the prisoners work to pull the ship upright. It's time. The staging of this first scene is honestly incredible to me. At first, Jean Valjean blends in with all the other convicts. Sure, he's played by Hugh Jackman, but he's surrounded by a sea of other men with identical long beards and identical shaved heads, all dressed in identical prison uniforms. They somehow manage to make Hugh Jackman disappear into a crowd. When the camera pans up, we see Inspector Javert. He's up on a ledge, excellent foreshadowing, and while Valjean is dirty and sopping wet, Javert is clean, dry, pristine and unbothered. Even someone with no knowledge of the basic story would know that Javert has power here. Right away, we see one of the reasons why this movie was so, if you'll pardon the pun, revolutionary. Every member of the cast is singing live. They're not lip-syncing to pre-made recordings of their own voices. They aren't dubbed. They're singing right then and right there. Sometimes this does work to the film's detriment, but sometimes it works flawlessly. But I'll get into that a little more later. First, there's something I have to say that might be controversial. I actually really like Russell Crowe's performance. I know his singing isn't maybe ideal for this genre, but I don't think it's bad, and I actually think he's the perfect Javert to play alongside Hugh Jackman as Jean Valjean. Remember how I mentioned that right away Javert stood out? I think the fact that Russell Crowe's voice isn't as tailored to this type of singing as the rest of the cast actually works towards that even more. Javert is the law. He would see himself as separate from the rest of the characters. It makes sense for his voice to have a different sound. I also think that in moments like these, Russell Crowe has the right sense of harshness to his voice to convey the authority that Javert carries. Regardless, the back and forth between these two is great. It's bombastic and bold, but there's still enough room for levity. After all, there's a reason why the "yes, it means I'm free, no" exchange tends to make people chuckle. It adds a touch of sarcasm to this rivalry between these two. And with Hugh Jackman and Russell Crowe actually being good friends in real life, there's definitely a sense of familiarity between this version of Valjean and this version of Javert. In fact, as Valjean leaves the shipyard and makes his way towards his pseudo-freedom, he glances back at Javert one last time. The inspector narrows his eyes. Valjean isn't off the hook yet. After this, we get what is, in my opinion, one of the most beautifully symbolic bits of metacasting I've seen in a long time. To call this a casting gag honestly feels disrespectful, because it's not a gag at all. It's something far more meaningful. The actor playing the bishop, the first man to give Valjean a chance to treat him as a human being instead of just a common criminal, Colm Wilkinson, who originated the role of Jean Valjean both in the West End and Broadway productions. It makes the moment so much more beautiful, as if the bishop is ready to accept Valjean because he sees a bit of himself in there. Colm's portrayal of the bishop is phenomenal too. He's just so perfectly warm and kind. Hugh Jackman's delivery of Valjean's soliloquy is already great. As you can see, he clearly puts his heart and soul into it. But what makes the scene even more well-crafted is the lighting. The darker Valjean's mental state in this scene, the more he steps back into the shadows. The more hopeful he feels, the brighter the room becomes. Perhaps it's a small detail, but it's one you can't help but notice once you're made aware of it. One time skip later, and we've already made our way to the third song, which also means we're about to see my favorite performance in this whole movie, Anne Hathaway's heart-wrenching portrayal of Fantine. We haven't even gotten to her big song yet, but already she's made me feel like she didn't just play Fantine. She became her. She doesn't just embody Fantine's virtue, innocence, and vulnerability either. She also perfectly captured the fact that Fantine is always willing to fight. The quiet fury she showcases when the factory foreman talks about how dirty she is for being an unwed mother is something that's easy to miss when thinking about Fantine as a character. After all, a more cynical person would argue that in the musical, Fantine basically just exists to show up, sing the show's best song, and die. But Fantine's fighting spirit is something that absolutely shouldn't be missed, and Anne Hathaway nailed it. If you haven't guessed yet, Fantine is one of my favorite characters ever. But more on that later, and why you can credit this movie with making me love her. Before that, though, there's a brief scene between Valjean and Javert that I just adore. While Valjean, now the mayor and using the alias of Madeleine, is trying to make sense of the chaos in the factory, Javert is ominously hovering above him. This particular image of Javert did become a bit of a meme, and it's understandable why. But in context, it's a powerful reminder that Valjean isn't out of the woods, that the danger isn't over yet. But for Fantine, the danger has already begun. Having lost her job at the factory, she has to resort to selling everything she has in order to support her daughter. When she runs out of possessions to sell, she resorts to selling her hair, her teeth, and finally, herself. It's here that we see my favorite decision that was made in adapting Les Mis to film, placing I Dreamed a Dream after Lovely Ladies. And this version of I Dreamed a Dream is achingly real. Fantine's voice here isn't perfect in the usual sense. Indeed, there are other recordings that I find more beautiful from a purely aesthetic standpoint. But her voice is absolutely perfect for the situation she finds herself in. This is a woman who has lost everything, and you can hear that in every note. And yet, somehow, there's still brief moments where you can see her eyes glimmer with a faint hope. You can see her briefly wonder if things could improve from here, if her dreams really could still come to fruition. But just as quickly, you can see those hopes fade as she realizes it's naive of her to assume that her life will be what she dreamed of. While there are mixed feelings about Tom Hooper's decision to feature so many close-ups in the film, I think this is one scene where it was absolutely the right call. We see every micro-expression on Fantine's face, every tear, every tremble of her lips, every anguished sigh. And the fact that it's entirely focused on her face makes that possible. It's almost uncomfortable, but maybe it should be. She's just been forced into prostitution, and now we as an audience are also unwittingly partaking in this vulnerable, intimate moment where nothing about Fantine is left to the imagination. The way the camera is angled means we see very little of Fantine's already minimal clothing. She seems almost naked, and as a result, that much more vulnerable. She truly has nothing. Everything is laid bare. And the performance is brilliant to the end. Fantine is desperate, and every aspect of both her behavior and appearance makes it obvious. And it makes her death scene so much more poignant, particularly the way we see her smile with genuine hope right before she passes away. Right after that, we get a fan favorite number, The Confrontation. Normally, I would perhaps complain if a film adaptation cut a verse from a song, but in this case, I'm actually glad they did. This isn't because I think Valjean's last verse is bad, quite the contrary, but rather because, with it being cut, that makes it impossible to ignore Javert's last verse. While, again, you could easily argue about whether or not Russell Crowe's singing is up to par, his acting in this scene works for me. There's a look of vulnerability on his face as he admits to Valjean that he was born inside a jail. There's almost a sense of shame as he remarks that he is from the gutter too. For a moment, Javert considers the idea that perhaps he and Valjean are not so different. But he dismisses it, at least for now. To acknowledge such a possibility would make things far too complicated. Castle on a Cloud is next, and Isabelle Allen, who plays the young Cosette, is just adorable. I have no complaints about her performance. She's just perfect. I don't even know what more to say. I mean, look at that face. One number that I truly feel doesn't get enough love in the film version is Master of the House. The chemistry between Helena Bonham Carter and Sacha Baron Cohen is weirdly believable. I almost feel like these two shouldn't be able to play off each other as well as they do, but they do. And the end result is that their comedic timing feels very natural. The staging of Master of the House, to me, is the funniest it's ever been here. There's so many little details to pick up on, and every time I rewatch it, I laugh more. It's a much-needed bit of levity in a very emotionally heavy story, and I encourage you to go back and focus on those little details. Whether it's the fact that Madame Thénardier has a tendency to steal things and then stick them in her hair, or the fact that Monsieur Thénardier has a young Eponine on his lap as he explains how he overcharges his guests. Ah, he's teaching her the family business. What a good father. Oh, and the Santa. Can't forget the Santa. I won't spoil it for those of you who haven't watched the film or just haven't watched it in a while, but keep an eye on Santa in this scene. One thing I love so much about this film is just how quickly Valjean is willing to be a father for Cosette. The dynamic between them is it's just adorable. I love how you can see her go from being afraid of the strange man she met in the woods to realizing she doesn't need to be afraid of him. In fact, that's why I actually really love the movie's new song, Suddenly. The sight of Cosette sleeping peacefully on Valjean's lap, as he wonders if he's actually cut out to be a father, is extremely poignant, and I think it serves the story well. Stars is a contentious number in the movie because it is, once again, Russell Crowe. But if nothing else, I love the way it's staged. The scene looks gorgeous. And of course, I can't ignore the foreshadowing of Javert once again standing on a ledge as he sings it. It's not subtle at all, but it's still clever. And speaking of things that are clever, it's time to meet Gavroche. Sorry, that was a terrible segue. Actually, if you look closely, you can see him in Master of the House, too, which is a nice little nod to the fact that he's the Thénardier's son and Eponine's little brother. But this is the first time we actually see him being an actual character, as opposed to just being a funny little thing to notice in the background. And we get another fun little reference to the novel, with Gavroche living inside the Elephant of the Bastille. I'll spare you the Victor Hugo-esque historical ramblings, but I encourage you to look this structure up, as it's a fascinating bit of history. Perhaps even more impressive than our Gavroche, though, is Aaron Tveit as Enjolras. I don't think any musical fan who's heard of Aaron Tveit would disagree that he's a phenomenal singer and actor, and this movie really gives him a chance to shine. In fact, that's another thing I love about this movie. The willingness to give these theater actors a chance to show that they can act on the big screen as well, and to get their names out there for a broader audience to appreciate. Samantha Barks reprising her role as Eponine is another great example of this. And it's crazy to think she almost wasn't cast. We could have lived in a world where Eponine was played by Taylor Swift. Which, as much as I personally like Taylor's music, is not something that I feel would have worked particularly well. And despite the fact that Samantha has played the role before, her performance isn't just a retread of her Eponine in the 25th anniversary concert. She knows that acting for a theater production, even a filmed one, requires a different approach than acting in a movie, and she adjusted her technique accordingly. The result is a very believable human Eponine whose infatuation with Marius, or more accurately the idea of Marius, is obvious to everyone, except him. Speaking of Marius, Eddie Redmayne is another controversial casting choice in the film version, and I absolutely get it. Vocally, he has one of the weaker performances in this movie. Now, this isn't to say he can't sing. He kind of wowed us all with his performance as the MC in Cabaret, but his singing is not as good as it could be here. But in terms of acting, I actually really like him as Marius. He captures the endearing awkwardness that makes Marius who he is. Giving Marius and Cosette chemistry is always sort of an uphill battle. I mean, in the musical, he quite literally falls in love with her at first sight, and almost immediately decides he wants to spend the rest of his life with her. But Eddie Redmayne and Amanda Seyfried do the best they can with the material they're given, and the result is honestly pretty cute. I actually really like Amanda Seyfried as Cosette, too. She isn't necessarily the strongest soprano, but she already looks exactly like how I pictured Cosette, aside from the blonde hair. Cosette was actually a brunette in the book. Her acting shows a clear understanding of the character as well. The bond she has with Valjean is very believable. But what really strikes me early on is just how cheerful she is during A Heart Full of Love. Marius is stumbling over his words and outright admitting that he's doing everything all wrong. And yet, Cosette clearly thinks his awkwardness is charming because of how genuine and sincere it is. It's a really cute dynamic. I've mentioned that the movie occasionally changes the order in which songs occur. And another good example of this is On My Own, which is moved to right before One Day More. I don't think this is a bad call. It gives us a bit more time to process who Eponine is and how she's feeling, which gives her death just a bit more sting. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Speaking of One Day More, there's a really endearing little detail I couldn't avoid mentioning. Gavroche gets really excited and quietly mutters, "Yes!" when Marius agrees to fight alongside the revolutionaries. I'm pretty sure I even saw him do a little fist pump. It's adorable, it's funny, and it's very in character. Really, everyone is giving One Day More their all. And for as much as some people feel that the live singing hampered some of the music, it definitely isn't the case here, at least. One Day More feels appropriately grandiose and anticipatory, and makes good use of the fact that it's in a movie format by cutting back and forth between the individual characters. It allows the number to have a grander scope that works for the medium it's being adapted to. And again, while it's not the most revolutionary idea for how to approach this scene, no pun intended, it works well. Speaking of things that work well, the way Do You Hear the People Sing is approached, and its new placement, works perfectly for the movie. In the show, it's usually right after Red and Black, taking place in the cafe with just the Barricade Boys taking part. And while there's nothing wrong with this placement, it can be odd for those who first heard the song out of context. Do You Hear the People Sing sounds like a protest song that should keep building as more people join in the song, marching toward their end goal. And that's exactly how it's approached here, because now it is the people who are singing. But it starts off quiet and understated, with just a few of the Barricade Boys singing their parts until they rally the crowd behind them. It's a powerful message that it takes a small voice to start a larger movement. A Little Fall of Rain hits hard in the film, too. I've already mentioned that with On My Own being moved to a bit earlier in the story. We got to spend a little bit more time with Eponine. If this was someone's first experience with Les Mis, they'd already have begun to form a very strong attachment because they've had time to process the emotional struggles that Eponine is dealing with. Her death hits hard here, whether it's because it's literally raining or the fact that the others clearly feel grief at her passing. In fact, there's once again another subtle reference to the novel here, with Gavroche visibly crying at the loss of Eponine because she's his big sister. And Gavroche's death stings just as hard as his sister's, with the others crying and begging for him to turn back and be spared, yet knowing that it's all in vain. I also liked Hugh Jackman's performance of Bring Him Home. Again, you could argue that it isn't the strongest from a vocal standpoint, but there's so much emotion in his performance that I can't help but be moved anyway. I don't even have much more to say about this number, it just makes me cry every time. Something that I find even more moving, though, is the way the deaths of the rest of the revolutionaries are portrayed. There's a poignant moment where Enjolras takes Grantaire by the hand, and the two defiantly stand, clutching a flag, before they're both shot to death, leaving Enjolras hanging through an open window. For a brief moment before they died, there was a true sense of respect and connection between them, despite the fact that earlier in the film, Enjolras seemed to find Grantaire annoying, to put it lightly. There's also a brief moment after all the students are dead and lying in the streets, in which Javert, grappling with the fact that his moral compass may be misplaced, realizing that black and white morality is a faulty way to view the world, encounters the lifeless body of Gavroche. As the melody of Bring Him Home plays in the background, Javert removes one of his own medals and pins it to the young boy's shirt instead, honoring the fact that this kid was as brave and loyal as a child could possibly be. In fact, remember how I mentioned that Bring Him Home was playing in the background? It's specifically the section that goes, "He's like the son I might have known, if God had granted me a son." This moment does wonders to humanize Javert, who soon begins to doubt his worldview even further. And he soon realizes he cannot continue living with these earth-shattering revelations. Russell Crowe's performance of Javert's final song isn't perfect. Even as someone who doesn't mind him in the role, I do think this is his weakest scene. But I still don't think it's bad. The cinematography is nice, and the sound mixing at the end is the best kind of disturbing. As Javert falls to his self-inflicted demise, you can hear a disturbing crunch sound once he hits the dam in the water below. It adds a sense of realism to the scene that makes the sadness we feel mingle with a sense of revulsion. I've gone through most of the best songs for now, and most of what I wanted to say about them, so I'm going to skip ahead to the finale, because it's a beautiful finale on its own, and it's definitely given a chance to shine in the film adaptation. What strikes me every time is just how warm this scene is, despite the sadness of the occasion. Valjean is literally dying in his adoptive daughter's arms, and yet he smiles. He even boops her on the nose. I know it sounds like such a silly detail, but it's a detail that I actually love. Because even in his last moments, Valjean is clearly still trying to be a father to Cosette. He's affectionate, he's comforting, he's proud of how far she's come, and he's willing to be a little bit silly like any good dad would be. As Fantine leads Valjean to the afterlife, she isn't accompanied by Eponine as she is in the stage version. This is a change that I actually don't mind too much, as Valjean barely interacted with Eponine. The connection between them doesn't feel as significant as the connection he already had with Fantine. But just because Eponine isn't there doesn't mean Fantine is alone. The bishop is also ready to welcome Jean Valjean to salvation. With what I mentioned earlier about the beautiful choice to cast Colm Wilkinson as the bishop, it makes this scene especially poignant. Even now, when I rewatch it, I can't help but cry. And yet, as the final reprise of Do You Hear the People Sing is performed, I feel a sense of hope, too. Because, as the song says, even the darkest night will end, and the sun will rise. Part 4. Greater Scope. By now, I've realized something curious. I went into this essay intending to argue why the Les Mis movie is good. And don't get me wrong, a lot of my arguments could probably be used to prove that point. But as I tried to make that argument, I realized that it wasn't the statement I actually wanted to make. Maybe a piece of media being good can be a subjective thing. A piece of media can be widely praised, but if you personally don't like it, then that's what matters in the end when it comes to how you would rank that movie. And the reverse is also true. I've realized that my argument didn't come from a desire to argue that Les Mis was an objectively good movie, because maybe there is no such thing. But there is such a thing as a movie that you, the viewer, love on a personal level no matter what. And for me, Les Mis is that movie. So, now that I've realized the true meaning of this little video essay, I guess I'll do my best to explain why. First of all, if I had to sum up this movie's greatest strength in one word, it would be dedication. When you research what went on behind the scenes, you realize how tired the cast and crew were, and how they were all extremely dedicated to their roles. Anna Hathaway came up with the idea to have Fantine's haircut occur on screen, to make the moment that much more impactful, and reportedly told the cameraman to keep filming if she were to accidentally be cut. Hugh Jackman has said, again, that playing Jean Valjean was harder than playing Wolverine. Tom Hooper, for all his flaws as a director, did at least have a point in wanting all the singing to be done live. It may not always serve the film for the best, but when it does work, it works incredibly and it becomes that much more authentic. The other reason I love this movie, though, is a bit more personal. You see, this movie was my introduction to Les Mis. It would be no understatement to say that this movie changed my life. Picture a 14-year-old girl who already loves musicals. But it's a passive sort of love. The love that's kind of an afterthought. The love where you don't go around saying, I love musicals, but if someone asks you if you love musicals, you'll be like, yeah. And then this movie comes along. It has two of her favorite actresses in it, so she's already interested. And once she sees it, this incredible, moving, beautiful musical falls into her life, and she can't help but love it. She can't stop singing the songs, she can't stop thinking about the characters, especially Fantine. She can't stop listening to the soundtrack. It teaches her what musicals can really be, the sheer depths that this art form can really cover. It makes her want to read the novel that's infamous for being overly long and including tangents about how, well, the Parisian sewer system used to be different than it was in the 1800s. It makes her want to be in musicals. It even provides her with her yearbook quote when she graduates from high school a few years later. It quickly becomes her favorite musical ever. And that hasn't changed even now. I wouldn't be who I was today without this movie. Good, bad, or otherwise, it means the world to me. And maybe that's what really matters in the grand scheme of things. Maybe that's what art is supposed to do.